AM950, the progressive voice of Minnesota, Brett Johnson with you. And right now we're joined by Ross Stadheim. He is with MJSB Employment Justice, who provides employment legal counsel to individuals who have experienced discrimination, retaliation, or harassment at the workplace as they advocate on your behalf so you can focus on moving forward. As today we're going to be talking about a topic that I think is going to be pretty prevalent coming up in 2023, and that has to do with the potential legalization of THC in the state of Minnesota. As during the last election, Democrats were able to flip both the state house and the state senate under DFL control. They, of course, also have the governor's mansion, and that means that there is a good chance that THC could be legalized in the state of Minnesota. But how could that impact you when it comes to drug testing at the workplace? Well, joining us now is Ross from MJSB Employment Justice. Hey, Ross, how are you doing today?
Good, Brett. How are you?
Hey, I'm doing good here. So I'm curious what your thoughts are on recreational THC being legalized in Minnesota, because I imagine people are probably nervous when it comes to thinking about things like drug tests, because I even think about other jobs I've had where I've been drug tested in the past. And usually for me, it's something I didn't really think too much about. I think, all right, well, I got to do this to get the job. And then you move on from there and largely forget about it. But now that we are going to have a lot of people that are probably, as we've seen from other states, THC gets very popular as soon as it gets legalized. I'm sure people are very nervous about how this could impact them at the workplace when it comes to drug testing.
For sure. People are very nervous about it. Well, and it's noteworthy to mention too that in July of 2022, Minnesota legalized Delta 9 products derived from hemp-derived Delta 9 products. Those are your gummies and the legal products that are being sold in Minnesota. But lucky for Minnesota employees, Minnesota has one of the most robust drug testing statutes on the books. It's called the Drug Testing in the Workplace Act, or as us employment lawyers call it, DATWA. And DATWA provides for a pretty much a very strict rubric that employers have to go through in Minnesota to drug test their employees, and if they just test positive for a substance, a banned substance, rights that the employee has before an adverse action or a termination is taken against that employee who tests positive for drugs in the workplace.
So I'm curious about this too, going back to what I was saying. When I, started other jobs, typically you sometimes have to take a drug test. Don't think too much about it, but how does this actually work at the workplace? Is an employer just able to test you whenever they want, or how does the process work? Because again, it's something I haven't really paid a lot of attention to, and I'm sure other folks are sitting there thinking, well, it's just something I've always done for a job, but now it's something we might have to think a little bit more about. So tell us how that works.
For sure. So in Minnesota, under DATWA, the Drug Testing in the Workplace Act, there's two categories, I would call them, of when you can drug test somebody. The first is there can be random drug testing, and there's only two categories of employees that can go through or have to adhere to random drug tests. Those are employees in safety-sensitive positions. And what's a safety-sensitive position? A safety-sensitive position would be like a forklift driver, a person who is impaired that can hurt themselves if they're impaired or hurt others. So it's a pretty broad brush. I mean, you could say maybe like an electrician too would be in a safety sensitive position because they could electrocute themselves, if they were impaired. But a person at a desk, just working at a desk job by themselves or something like that would not be in a safety sensitive position, and they would not be subject to random drug tests. Another broad category of folks who are subject to drug tests are if there's reasonable suspicion testing. And that basically means if, you get in an accident at work, if you sustain a personal injury at work, or if you smell like booze or you smell like, drugs at the workplace, or you're acting strange. Those folks can also, be under reasonable suspicion testing. But this is the key. You have to have a written policy in Minnesota. If you don't have a written policy on the books and you don't present that policy and make it known to your employees, you cannot drug test a person or an applicant under any circumstances in Minnesota.
Well, I like to get into some of the experience you've had with some of these types of cases, but let's really dive in a little bit more about what this law actually says so people are aware of what their rights are. So let's say you are someone who's at work and you do end up testing positive for a substance that your employer says you can't have. What rights do you have as an employee if you do test positive?
So first off, first the employer has to have a written policy. Okay. And
Hmm.
they have to present you with a form that says that you've seen that policy and you sign off on that form. Okay. So that's number one. Number two, if you test positive for a banned or an illegal substance at work, before, and then you take a test and you test positive, before you can be terminated, the employer has to provide you with an opportunity to explain a positive test. Okay.
Hmm.
And they also have to provide you with the opportunity to have a confirmatory test on the positive test before terminating your employment. And not only that, the employer has to, at your own expense, you have to pay for this. They have to provide the person who tested positive, with an opportunity to go through rehab
Gotcha. Okay. So there's
before they terminate your
yeah,
employment.
before they terminate you. So that leads me to my next point. As you're talking about, the employee has a chance to provide a reasonable explanation. And I imagine, since, as you said, in 2022, we did legalize hemp derived THC edibles. So let's say you're someone who's taken some of those substances and all of a sudden you have a drug test at work, you end up testing positive, but you ended up taking this legal substance while you're at home on your own time, not on the employer's watch. What happens in that situation? Can an employer still fire you? Or if you do run into that situation, should you seek out legal counsel? Because that does seem like kind of a gray area to me, or you've been taking legal substances at home on your own time, not at work. So I'm curious how that works.
Great question, Brett, because this is where things are getting very, very interesting right now. So, as you said, the gummies or the hemp derived legal products at Minnesota that you can purchase legally in Minnesota, and if you take those on your own time, and then you are terminated for that reason because you test positive for an illegal drug at work, and they're like, "Hey, are you taking marijuana?" And you're like, "No, I'm taking these legally bought gummies." Okay. And then you're terminated for that reason, the employer is going to have big problems, because in Minnesota, there's also a second statute called the Lawful Consumable Products Act. And that statute says that I cannot be terminated for using a legal product on my own time. So if you explain to your employer that, hey, I'm using a lawfully purchased gummy that I got at a smoke shop, down the road from my house, that's the explanation as to why I'm testing positive for marijuana, and they terminate you anyway, you're going to have a cause of action under the Lawful Consumable Products Act for wrongful termination. Now, it's interesting because there's currently no commercially available way for drug tests to differentiate between, what is a marijuana derived, product that's currently illegal in our state, and what's a hemp derived gummy product that is legal in our state. So there's really no way for the employer to tell, if you're telling the truth or not. And, there's also no way for the employer to tell, when you took that product without hard evidence.
So that would be an intimidating situation if you're an employee and you've had some edibles the other day or the other week or something like that, and you've tested positive, because technically, yeah, you probably are in the clear, but that can be very intimidating when you're getting disciplined by your employer or you're potentially being terminated from your position. That can be very, very stressful when you're sitting there thinking, really, this was just over some THC edibles. But that's why you really do need to seek out legal counsel in this situation, because you do not want to end up getting terminated for something like this when technically, yeah, you are in the clear, even though you might end up testing positive. That's really got to be tough for employees right now when you, as you say, there's no way to really be able to tell whether you're having the legal substances or, I guess, for lack of a better way of putting it, the stuff you get on the street, which is still technically illegal.
Right, right. That's why please call us if there's any sort of gray area or the situation. It's difficult for employees, but it's also difficult for employers with this gray area kind of up in the area, and the interplay between DATWA, the drug testing statute in Minnesota, and also the Minnesota Lawful Consumable Products Act too. So there's a really big interplay between those two statutes in this interesting time.
So I'm curious about this too, because I'm not really in the know on this, but are people still getting fired for having violations of being under the influence of marijuana or having that being tested positive for? Is that something that's still happening? Because for some folks, that might be kind of shocking to hear, thinking that, well, here we are decades and decades later where marijuana is a little bit more socially acceptable, but people are still getting fired over this, correct?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, fact of the matter is you don't want employees who are impaired in safety sensitive positions. That's just dangerous. That's bad policy. That's dangerous. And we don't want that. But also I have 2 cases right now where just this exact thing happened. You know, a person gets tested for marijuana at work. They explain that, hey, you know what? I have been taking these, legally purchased gummies in Minnesota on my own time. And so so it might show up on this test. And regardless of that explanation, they've still been terminated without any evidence that they were using the illegal street marijuana.
Speaking with Ross Stadheim of MJSB Employment Justice. By the way, make sure you go to mjsbjustice.com as we are talking about drug testing in Minnesota, especially with the fact that, well, THC-derived hemp edibles were legalized in 2022, and it does appear likely in 2023 we could have a further expanded legalization with a change of the political landscape in our state. So this is a very important topic to talk about because I think a lot of people are going to be nervous about how things could change during 2023 and beyond. So let's dive right into this. Let's say we do have expanded legalization of THC products in Minnesota. How could that potentially change drug testing in Minnesota? Would we have employers need to issue new types of drug tests, or how would they be able to distinguish between, well, legal substances or the illegal substances you might end up testing for?
Well, I think it'll actually be probably good for employers because now, if I were an employer now and I drug test, folks for, whatever, during the workplace, now you just you can X out, marijuana, unless there's like an accident or something like that, because then, you're going to want to, test for that impairment and as well as alcohol.
So essentially you're saying that could be something that could be eliminated from the list of substances that they could test you for in the future if it does end up getting legalized?
Well, I don't know about eliminated. That's interesting because I don't know if it could be really eliminated now that I think about it a little bit more, because, it's going to be interesting to see how this play out. And I don't have all the answers right here, but I mean, if you're high at work, you can still be terminated for that.
Right.
But there's really no commercially available test to, test some, because it has to be tested through the blood to test if somebody's actually like high on the job, whether just like you can test if somebody's drunk. Right. So that's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. People smarter than me are going to have to figure that out.
Yeah, absolutely. So certainly that could, as you say, it could end up making things more helpful for employers, though, if this does end up getting legalized in 2023 and maybe eliminate some of that gray area, though, correct?
It could eliminate some of the interplay between the Lawful Consumable Products Act and, the and DATWA. But then again, it's also going to, make things a little bit more difficult, because how do you test for somebody who's, high on the job other than, your observations? Because if they're explaining to you that, no, I am using these, legal products, or I'm smoking weed, which is now legal, during the evenings, and it's still just in my system because weed stays in your system for, 21 days or 24 days or whatever it is. And it lingers. So they're going to have to develop some sort of new test, I believe, in order to, figure out, are you actually high on the job?
So how has this played out in other states? For instance, I'm thinking about the obvious examples like Colorado and California. Have they run into situations as soon as THC was legalized where all of a sudden they've had issues of employees being fired wrongfully for drug testing? So I'm curious how this has played out in other states, and if Minnesota can maybe follow the lead of what other states have done.
Right. I'm not sure if Colorado or a place like California or Washington has, a drug testing statute that is as robust as Minnesota's statute is. So I'm really not sure what they have. I am aware in California that in effective in 2024, California expressly prohibits discrimination against employees who consume marijuana outside of work hours. How you test for that, how they approve that, I'm really not sure, because the law is going into effect in 2024.
Couple more final questions for you, Ross. So, what advice would you give for people if they are having a drug test that's coming up, especially as we've been talking about this gray area that we kind of have? What would you advise people to do if they're an employee and they are getting drug tested and maybe have some concerns about possibly testing positive?
Well, what I would advise, if you have a if you have a policy for drug testing in the workplace, go to your employee handbook, see if that's actually active. If you're not sure, so yeah, go look at your employee handbook and see if there's a drug testing policy in that handbook. Also, you should do some Googling, look up DATWA, know what your rights are, know that you have the opportunity to explain a positive test, know that your employer can't terminate you until they offer you rehab on your own dime and you've denied. You said, I don't want to do that. Know that you have the opportunity to have a confirmatory test. So just generally, you don't have to know exactly what the statutes are. You don't have to know, exactly what magic words to use, but just know generally that information is available to you, both on our website and other websites, detailing what your rights are under DATWA, what your rights are under the Lawful Consumable Products Act.
I think that's the important part, because if you test positive, your employer can't just automatically say, you're fired, you're out the door. That can't happen whatsoever. And I'm sure, even though that's technically in the law, it does happen sometimes with employers. And that's why it's important to make sure that you have legal counsel on your side if you do end up testing positive, because I imagine it can be kind of embarrassing if you're sitting there as an employee. Boy, do I really want to get involved legally with this? But as you pointed out, we have very strong employee protections in Minnesota when it comes to drug testing. And it is important to make sure you get that proper legal representation if you do run into that situation, so you don't end up getting terminated, because no one wants that on their resume saying, hey, I was terminated from this job for testing positive for an illegal substance.
Right, exactly. And if you are terminated right away without being provided those rights, those are great cases. Those are it's a horrible situation to be terminated. It's not fun. You don't have an income. You're concerned for how you're going to make rent. You're concerned with how you're going to pay for, your kids, food and all that kind of stuff. But the saving grace is if you're not provided those rights and then boom, you're terminated. Those are pretty good cases in what we like to call strict liability, kind of open and shut. Did you provide, I talked to pose an employer, did you provide them with this written policy? Well, no, we don't have a written policy. You violated the statute.
So talk a little bit about what sorts of clients you've represented in these types of cases, because as it sounds like you've represented plenty of clients that have run into this situation before. So talk us a little bit through about what kind of people you do represent.
Right. We represent everybody, from people in, a C-suite executive office all the way down to, somebody who, works in the food service industry, excuse me. A lot of times when the DATWA statute does pop up, it does tend to, it over affects people in more blue collar positions, I would say, because of those are the type of employers who have drug testing policies. Folks that are more in white collar positions, like, an accounting office or something like that, don't typically have drug testing policies on the books. So it's just not an issue. So it's typically more your industry type positions.
Well, Ross, we are just about out of time. We have been speaking with Ross Stadheim of MJSB Employment Justice about drug testing in Minnesota, especially in light of THC hemp-derived edibles being legalized in 2022 and further legalization potentially on the horizon in 2023. Something to pay attention to, because no one wants that positive drug test, and you do have rights if you do end up testing positive. And that's why it's important to make sure you reach out to someone like Ross over at MJSB Employment Justice. Again, website mjsbjustice.com. Ross, thanks so much for coming in. This is really interesting to hear about, and I'm sure we're going to be hearing a lot more about this in 2023 as the laws end up changing. Thanks for coming in.
Thanks, Brett. It was awesome.